Chapter 2. Investigating Jesus. After deciding that God likely exists, I ran up against a new and equally challenging question. Which God? There were plenty for the infant theist to choose from. Many have claimed to have special knowledge about God, but I noticed that two such people were especially influential: Jesus, sometimes called Christ, and Muhammad. The religions founded by these two alone, Christianity and Islam, accounted for over half the world's population. If I brought in atheism, close to two-thirds of the population was accounted for. But the mere fact of being common was not enough to lend credibility to a worldview. A brief perusal of social media on any given day is enough to remind me that what Aristotle wrote in the 4th century BC remains as true as ever in the modern world: that people are quite often untrained thinkers, unable to follow a train of logic very far. I knew it would be foolish to let popularity alone govern my path. I decided to survey the great minds that had influenced me to consider God's existence in the first place. One would expect a great mind to have better developed thoughts than most, and any trends among such minds would be worth considering. Upon investigation, I discovered that the bulk of the great minds identified with Christianity or had at least wrestled with its claims. This is where I saw the credibility of Christianity begin to grow. And it is what led me to investigate Christianity first. A substantial handful of the great minds were also deists, but deists believe in an uninvolved God who set the universe in motion, then stepped back and observed the results from a distance like a petri dish. Deism therefore left nothing to investigate at that phase. I had already found God's existence more likely than not, so if I investigated the world religions and found them unconvincing, I would still have the cold, impersonal God of deism waiting for me with open arms. As usual, at the trailhead of Christianity, I discovered a long list of debatable topics with no real guidance on which topics merited my immediate attention. I considered which topics got to the core of the matter and realized that the core of Christianity is Christ himself. Specifically, there are two core claims the Christians make about him. First, they say he is the Son of God, and second, that he physically rose from the dead after being dead for 3 days. Concerning the first claim, that Jesus is the Son of God, I saw no straightforward way to evaluate it. Even if Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and even if many others agreed, this claim standing alone could not prove itself. A claim must be supported by evidence if a person would rationally believe it. But what sort of evidence would support the claim that someone is the Son of God? Well, one effective category of evidence for establishing divine sonship would be doing something miraculous, say, walking on water, healing the chronically ill with a word, or correctly predicting the future. The whole idea of a miracle is that it's impossible within ordinary nature and science, so nothing could better establish a connection to God, who is, by definition, beyond nature, than performing miracles. One rather compelling miracle would be rising from the dead. It became clear that the two core claims of Christianity are closely intertwined. The best way to support the first claim, that Jesus was the Son of God, would be with the second claim, that Jesus rose from the dead. If Jesus really rose from the dead, I would have to take him seriously. Like many before me, as I set out to investigate whether Jesus really did rise from the dead, I was initially put off by the raw absurdity of the question. People simply do not rise from the dead, and I felt that this resurrection claim reeked of mythology. But, like many before me, I was soon stunned by the strength of the evidence. I expected something a little weaker, given the confidence of the atheists, but what I found could not be easily dismissed without a serious breach of my intellectual honesty. One early thing I noticed was that the question of Jesus' resurrection has nothing to do with science, despite the remarkable number of passionately anti-Christian scientists I observed belittling Christianity as unscientific. The problem is, science examines the natural world in its normal state, thus placing miracles, which are unnatural by definition, outside the purview of science. For another, science relies on repeatability. If I heat water to 212 degrees Fahrenheit or hotter, it boils every time, no matter how often the process is repeated. But even ordinary, let alone miraculous, historical events aren't repeatable under laboratory conditions. Can you name one scientific experiment that can repeatedly prove that Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address? If so, I congratulate you on your invention of the time machine and suggest that you stop reading right now and go see firsthand whether Jesus rose from the dead. In the meantime, before you get back, the rest of us will have to rely on the kinds of evidence historians rely on as we evaluate the resurrection of Jesus. It was here, during my historical analysis of the resurrection, that I became truly stunned by the evidence. The most comprehensive analysis I encountered on the topic was laid out in the 860 pages of Professor N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, the breadth of which demonstrates just the sort of mammoth undertaking this inquiry can be. A brief but similarly influential book on the topic came from Professor F. F. Bruce in New Testament Documents. Are They Reliable? Despite the enormity of the inquiry, much of the evidence could be distilled into a straightforward summary that flows naturally from 1. The strength of the historical evidence to 2. The facts shown by that evidence, and concludes with 3. The logical implications of those facts. The strength of the historical evidence. This was a matter of simple comparison. I compared the biblical New Testament, which claims to record the life of Jesus in the immediate aftermath, to other ancient histories from around the same time. When making this comparison, 2 points of data were especially salient. 1. The number of surviving manuscripts, and 2. The time gap between the original documents and the earliest manuscripts now available. For instance, take the manuscripts of a few well-known ancient historians, including Herodotus, born circa 484 BC, Thucydides, born circa 460 BC, and Julius Caesar, born 100 BC. There are 8 surviving manuscripts from Herodotus, 8 from Thucydides, and 10 from Julius Caesar. And how many from the New Testament? Around 5,600. And the time gaps between the original documents and our manuscripts were no less staggering. The gap for Herodotus was 1,300 years. For Thucydides was 1,300 years, and for Julius Caesar was 1,000 years. And the New Testament? Well, it depends on the manuscript. For one account of the life of Jesus, the Gospel of John, the gap was 29 years. All earliest New Testament manuscripts are within 100. When I first saw these statistics, I found them impressive, but also wondered why they mattered. 5,600 copies of bogus is still bogus, isn't it? And that would remain true no matter how soon after the alleged events the bogus was written. Here's why these numbers are important. When evaluating history from the time around the New Testament, we don't have the luxury of extensive journals, news articles, or photographs. What we have instead are manuscripts of the events as they were remembered by contemporaries, or, even more remote, as they were verbally passed down from one generation to the next before being written down. Unsurprisingly, manuscripts tend to differ from each other, sometimes significantly. They were handwritten by people, and people make mistakes. That said, there are ways to ensure that such mistakes are limited. First, you can have a large sampling of manuscripts to compare to one another. That way it's easier to tell when some mistake is in fact a mistake. If only 2 manuscripts exist and they contradict each other, how will you tell which is the correct one and which is the error? It's a coin toss, but if you have 100 manuscripts and only one of them contains some error, you have 99 reasons to think it really is an error. A second way to limit mistakes is to be sure the manuscript was written as close to the time of the events as possible. The longer it is between an event and its translation from word of mouth into writing, the easier it is for the story to morph into something very different from what really happened. Exaggerations, legends, and big fish stories are sure to creep in. The significance of the quantifiable New Testament statistics was now clear. I couldn't prove any historical event with certainty, but there were quantifiable ways to make some historical accounts look more credible than others. There were quite literally numbers that I could use to measure the New Testament against parallel histories, as readily as I could measure my own height. And under those numbers, the New Testament had advantages over its contemporaries to the tune of more than 5,500 manuscripts and more than 950 years. If the height of the parallel histories was equal to my height, the New Testament was a skyscraper. Less quantifiable, but no less impressive, is just how harmonious the New Testament books are with one another. After all, the New Testament is not one book written by one author, nor was it written by authors intending to compile their work into what we now call the New Testament. Rather, the New Testament is a collection of 27 disparate essays and letters written by at least 7 authors, each with a unique style and perspective. Despite this diversity and lack of planning, all 27 documents are centered on Jesus, his rise from the dead, and his status as the Son of God, and they were written by people claiming to be among hundreds who saw Jesus alive after his death. Given the historical strength of the New Testament, I had to ask myself why the parallel historians were met at worst with polite skepticism, whereas the New Testament came under such fierce attack, but the answer seemed obvious to me. The New Testament brims with miracles and grand religious claims, and Christianity's opponents seem to have arrived at the New Testament with preset notions of what is possible. Another word for this is bias. As for me, I could not ignore the fact that by first century historical standards, someone might as well have followed Jesus around with a video camera. Facts shown by the evidence. With the historical strength of the New Testament firmly in place, it was natural to move on to the facts supported by those documents, and there were numerous facts to consider. For instance, there is the fact that Jesus once turned water into wine at a party, or the fact that Paul once preached so deeply into the night that someone in his audience fell asleep and plummeted to his death from a third-story window. I learned that the facts within the New Testament have varying levels of credibility, some fiercely disputed, others hardly disputed at all. Thus, I had to decide 1, which facts asserted in the New Testament were most relevant to my broader investigation of the Christian claims, and 2, whether those facts were supported by the evidence. Of course, it had already been established that the New Testament documents as a whole had strong indicators of credibility, but even so, not all facts within those documents were equally well founded. Take the story I mentioned a moment ago, where Paul preached someone to death. That fact was mentioned one time in one New Testament document, which means its credibility is largely contingent on the credibility of that book and its writer. On the other hand, there is the account of Jesus rising from the dead and presenting himself, execution wounds and all, to hundreds of people. That fact is either expressly stated, often from firsthand experience, or forms the underlying assumption of every document in the New Testament. Having such a diversity of first-hand witnesses significantly boosts the credibility of that fact. The reason it is important to recognize that New Testament facts can be placed on a sliding scale of increased to decreased credibility is that many opponents of Christianity will attempt to discredit the entire New Testament and every fact therein by pinpointing some of its least credible facts. For instance, the writers of 2 New Testament documents say Jesus spent 40 days alone in the wilderness immediately after his baptism, whereas another says Jesus began gathering disciples the day after he was baptized. Both can't be true, and there are plenty more contradictions to choose from. Faced with such contradictions, many opponents of Christianity would say I was obligated to disbelieve every fact asserted in the New Testament. I, however, could not see how it was rational to use the least credible facts, not to mention the least relevant to my inquiry, as a basis for disregarding the most credible and relevant. If 2 eyewitnesses to a collision agree without question that car A and car B collided, must I decide the crash never happened if one witness said the driver of car B was wearing a silver watch, while another witness said his watch was gold? I've certainly never seen a legal case lost on such a thin basis. Juries know better. You don't knock down a house by tearing off its shutters. You knock it down by attacking its foundation, the sturdy parts that hold it up. I was trying to determine whether the foundational facts of Christianity were true, not trying to prove that the eyewitnesses who wrote the New Testament recalled the events with flawless accuracy. I also came across a handful of atheists who insisted that the historical narrative about Jesus' life was not credible because no objective or unbiased witnesses attested to it, by which they meant there were no non-Christian witnesses or witnesses not included in the Bible. They seemed unaware that neutrality and objectivity are 2 different things. A person is objective if he examines the evidence and draws reasonable conclusions from it. A person is biased if he examines the evidence, then skews his conclusion in favor of what he already hopes to believe. Neutrality, on the other hand, isn't inherently objective or biased. Neutrality certainly can be objective, but it can also be ridiculous. Consider the famously basic question: if you add 2 and 2, do you get 4? The objective, unbiased answer is yes. The neutral answer is, I don't know, it could go either way. And if you elect to remain neutral on the question of 2 plus 2, do not expect others to praise you for your rigorously unbiased intellect. The New Testament includes books written by at least 7 different people who claim to see Jesus risen from the dead firsthand, and because they witnessed the events of Jesus' life and resurrection and went on to follow him, their writings were included in the compilation that became the modern Bible. Now let's assume for the sake of argument that Jesus really was everything he claimed to be and really did rise from the dead. What kind of objective and unbiased witness could these atheists need in order to find Jesus' story credible? Well, apparently they needed a witness who saw Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, but remained unconvinced of his divinity. You see how they have once again stacked the deck in their favor? To require a witness so biased that he could observe the events of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection while remaining unconvinced is to make it all but impossible to believe, even if the Christians are right. They demanded a witness in their corner credible enough to argue that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. Their biased insistence on neutrality betrayed their lack of objectivity. Moving forward, what I found was that some facts within the New Testament were well attested and therefore credible, and these happened to be the facts most relevant to my inquiry. Especially noteworthy were the following 2, both of which were attested by numerous first-hand witnesses. 1. Jesus was an influential teacher who was executed for his claim to be the Son of God. And 2. A significant number of people saw Jesus risen from the dead, many of whom were later executed for their loyalty to him. Logical implications of the facts. I now had a New Testament with sturdy historical backing and some key facts well established by the evidence, but what did it all mean? Well, for one, I had to face the fact that Christianity blossomed into a worldwide phenomenon because multiple people went around proclaiming they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. Not only the New Testament, but numerous parallel histories attest to this fact. Especially striking was that these witnesses would rather die cruel deaths than give up the claim. Now, when multiple people are willing to die for the claim that they saw a dead man risen, it leaves only a few possible explanations. 1. They were all lying and willing to die for the lie. 2. They all hallucinated the same hallucination. 3. The man never died in the first place. Or 4. They genuinely saw the dead man risen. Hardly anyone, let alone a large group, would be willingly tortured to death for a known lie. Nor is there any documented instance of a large group hallucinating a coherent, shared hallucination at all comparable to the resurrection of Jesus. And considering that Jesus was publicly executed by the Romans via crucifixion, a method they had honed into a science, I found it difficult to imagine how they could have managed to botch Jesus' execution, especially when everyone involved, including those calling for his death, had heard him claim he was going to rise from the dead and were on guard against any trickery. Only one plausible explanation emerged. The witnesses must have really seen Jesus die and then rise from the dead. I simply wasn't prepared to hang my intellectual hat on a botched execution, group hallucination, or group martyrdom for a lie. Although the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead was certainly as remarkable as the alternatives added to their remarkability that they were random and entirely speculative, unsupported by one shred of historical evidence. The resurrection of Jesus, on the other hand, was a crucial element within a coherent and well-attested story centered on revealing the divine to humanity. Further bolstering the coherency of the Christian story was Christ himself. Here is a man whose 2,000-year-old sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, remains to this day one of the pillars of moral teaching around the world. The New Testament that gives us the Jesus wise enough to teach the Sermon on the Mount is the New Testament that gives us the Jesus who repeatedly insists that he is the Son of God and predicts that he will rise from the dead. As C.S. Lewis famously argued in Mere Christianity, we are once again left with only a few options. Either 1, Jesus was lying, 2, Jesus was afflicted with sincere delusions of divinity, or 3, Jesus truly was the Son of God. Lord, liar, or lunatic. As for lying, it is not difficult to imagine someone lying about their divinity to gain a reputation. Never mind that for Jesus, such a lie was grossly inconsistent with his teachings on honesty and fair dealing. Hypocrisy is nothing unusual. I could step into any church and see that. But Jesus was tortured to death precisely for his claim to be the Son of God, and he never gave up the claim, even while the Roman soldiers were flogging the skin off his back and driving nails through his limbs. I found myself once again face to face with the absurdity of believing that someone held to a lie in the face of torture and execution, a lie that would, if truly false, be a rather silly and pointless one. And as for delusions, many have fallen mentally ill and honestly believed they were divine, but none to my knowledge who went on to upend the entire history and philosophy of the world. How could I attribute wild delusions of godhood to the same mind that produced such timeless wisdom as Jesus did? Again, I could not believe it. Thus, in the final analysis, two of the best attested facts in the New Testament led me very naturally to the same conclusion. Jesus must have been who he claimed to be. When I investigated the existence of God, I found difficulty after difficulty compounding on the atheist, and my investigation of Christianity was no different. At every phase of the investigation, the opponent of Christianity had to explain away something extraordinary. The New Testament manuscripts' drastic advantages over parallel histories, the sheer number of witnesses attesting to the foundational Christian claims, and the most rational conclusions to be drawn from what those witnesses saw. Christianity itself had become for me a powerful argument for theism. After all, Jesus couldn't be the resurrected Son of God if God didn't exist. There were still things about theism and Christianity that struck me as intellectually difficult. Intellectual difficulties cannot be avoided in any worldview. Even so, the evidence for God had grown weightier when combined with the evidence for Christianity, and Christianity was becoming difficult to resist. Prayer. God, I still don't know what to believe, but I've seen evidence that I just can't ignore. Evidence that Jesus came from wherever you are, that he was your son, that he rose from the dead. Could it be true, God? Did you really send Jesus to us? Why would you do that? What would that mean? I want to understand. More and more, I think you really might be there, and if you are, please don't let me be deceived. Is Jesus the truth, as he claimed to be? Can you help me see the truth?